Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Andrew Kallick, a member of City Club's Forum Board and a co-producer of today's program, along with Oriana Magnera. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come to find solutions to our region's biggest problems. We are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of people via X-Ray FM and its radio stations at 107.1 and 91.1 FM. KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all the work they do to bring Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank AARP Oregon, Avangrid Renewables, and SEIU 49 for their generous support of this and all of our Friday Forums this fall. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. I will now turn the microphone over to John Horvick, Vice President and Political Director for DHM Research and a former City Club President, who will begin our debate.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to our panelists and our voters with us today. On stage with me today are both sides of Measure 104, which would amend the Oregon Constitution to define and expand the kind of bills that are considered, quote, bills for raising revenue, that require the approval of a 3/5 majority of all members of each house of the legislature. Currently, the Oregon Constitution requires bills for raising revenue to receive 3/5 vote of approval in each house, but the Constitution does not further explain what a bill for raising revenue is. Oregon courts have said that a bill for raising revenue must do two things. The bill must collect or bring money into the Treasury and either impose a new tax or increase the rate of an existing tax. Similarly, a bill that creates or increases a fee is not considered a bill for raising revenue under current law. Likewise, the elimination of a tax exemption or deduction is not considered a bill for raising revenue. Ballot Measure 104 adds a definition of raising revenue to the Constitution. Under the measure, a bill is considered to be raising revenue if it results in a tax or fee increase through the 1, creation of a new tax or fee, 2, increase in the rate of an existing tax or fee, or 3, modification, elimination, or change in the eligibility for any exemption, credit, deduction, or lower rate of taxation. Under any of those circumstances, the measure would require the bill to be approved by a 3/5 majority of all members in each house of the legislature. For our debate today, on the yes side, we have Paul Cosgrove, an attorney who leads the Lindsay Hart State Government Affairs team. Mr. Cosgrove's team represents leading national and local trade associations and companies in dealing with the Oregon legislature, state agencies, and local governments. And we have Jenny Dressler, the director of Grassroots and a lobbyist for the Public Affairs Council. Ms. Dressler previously served as director of the state public policy at the Oregon Farm Bureau, where she oversaw state lobbying on key issues including taxes, employment, environment, and regulatory approaches. On the no side, we have John Bartholomew, the Government Relations Director for AARP Oregon. Mr. Bartholomew has also served as Public Policy Director for the Alzheimer's Association Oregon chapter and has worked in public policy for more than 20 years. And joining him is Representative Rob Noss, the State Representative for House District 42 in Southeast Portland. Representative Noss is the Vice Chair of the House Committee on Healthcare and also serves on the Revenue and Rules Committee. To open our debate, each side will have 90 seconds for a statement. Once the opening statements have concluded, we'll move on to questions. Each side will have 60 seconds to answer each question. Questions were collaboratively developed by City Club's community, and no questions were shared in advance with our panelists. When I have completed my prepared questions, each side will have an opportunity to give a 90-second closing statement. Once the prepared questions and statements are complete, I will ask audience questions via note cards. We won't be taking questions from the microphone today, so if at any time during the debate you have a question, please write it down and hold it high in the air so City Club staff can collect it. Each side will have 45 seconds to answer each audience question. All of you in the room today, we are glad that you're here, but please refrain from clapping or cheering during the debate. It's important that our broadcast audience hears from both sides without interruptions. However, if you do hear something that catches your attention, positively or negatively, snap your fingers and let us know that it's an important topic. The debaters and all of you should know that if either side goes past their allotted time, their microphones will be turned off and the discussion will move on.
Okay.
We flipped a coin to determine who would give the opening remarks first, and the no side won the coin toss, which means that the yes side will begin with closing statements at the end. So, our no on Measure 104?
Yep,
Please
we're ready.
begin.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, City Club members and listeners, and thank you for having us here with you this afternoon. Measure 104 would lock into Oregon's Constitution an unprecedented and untested measure expanding our supermajority requirement far beyond anything we have seen anywhere else in the United States. And contrary to what you may hear from the proponents today, it's clear to me, as a legislator, that Measure 104 will usher in a new and troubling, more partisan chapter in Salem and our capital. Not only would Measure 104 make it harder to rein in wasteful tax breaks and deductions, it would also require a supermajority to approve increases to more than 2,400 fees that are adopted every biennium. No other state requires a supermajority to approve fees, and for good reason. Again, no other state requires a supermajority for all legislatively approved fees. Kind of like our kicker, no other state does that either. We're talking about fees that doctors and nurses willingly agree to pay to ensure that they are properly trained and regulated, fees that the DEQ uses to safeguard air and water quality, fees that make sure Oregonians pass background checks for receiving a concealed handgun.
Our yes side?
Thank you, and thank you from me as well for inviting us here to give a few reasons why we think you should support Measure 104. A little bit of history. 22 years ago, Oregonians decided there were particular decisions that the legislature was called upon to make that required more than a bare majority, should require more than a bare majority. And ballot measure 25 in 1996 established the 3/5 requirement that Representative Noce just discussed. The arguments against that measure were the same as you're hearing today. It will cause gridlock, it'll cause unprecedented problems and fights within the legislative process. Frankly, it didn't happen then, and we don't think it'll happen now. This is not an unusual provision. 25 states in this United States have supermajority requirements, either to pass new revenue, to adopt a budget, or both. Our friends to the south in California established a new supermajority requirement of 2/3, higher than ours, just in 2010, and it applies to almost all fees. In any case, we would hope that you would take a look at what has happened in those first 10 or 15 years and recognize we didn't have gridlock. The problem came a few years ago when the legislature started to get quite creative with loopholes. What Measure 104 does is it closes those loopholes and returns us to the position we had in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where there was bipartisan cooperation if we wanted to raise revenue. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to begin the debate by trying to set the stage and perhaps allow you to extend your opening remarks a bit. But in my own research about 104 and listening to the discussion among voters, it seems as though many people talk about their like or dislike of a supermajority at all and are less focused on the specifics of 104. So is this the debate we're having today and broadly about Measure 104? Is it about a more narrow debate, the wisdoms of a supermajority, 3/5 majority for some fees and tax deductions? Or is it a broader debate about the wisdom of supermajorities generally for taxes or for legislation at all? And I believe that goes to, who goes? Our proponents will go first.
Thank you. I think it's, for some people who oppose Measure 104, it's a little bit of both. I think some people would wish we could turn back the clock to 1996, but that ship has sailed, and Oregon has joined, as I say, 25 other states in having some sort of a supermajority requirement. Our concern has been a continual erosion through loopholes that the legislature has created to get around that constitutional requirement. And in essence, in most respects, what Measure 104 does is it reestablishes the same requirements that we all thought we had when we voted for Measure 25 in 1996. There is an issue about fees not being covered in the original ballot measure in 1996, and we expressly cover them here because that's one of the loopholes that the legislature has created. In the last couple of years, we've had proposals for new programs that are going to raise $1.4 billion a biennium, and they're being described as fees. They're really taxes. You ought not to be able to get around the requirement just by relabeling what you're doing.
Okay. So I believe that the debate is largely about what we're talking about today. I mean, we've been living under Measure 25 for many years now, and I do want to point out that Measure 25, the proponents of Measure 25 that established the supermajority requirements for raising revenue, explicitly put in the voter pamphlet statement the 3/5 vote requirement would apply only to bills that have a principal purpose of raising revenue. If a bill only incidentally raises revenue, the bill would not be subject to the 3/5 vote requirement and would need only a simple majority of each house of the legislature to pass. And that's what we've been working with. And maybe there are the occasional unusual situation, but Measure 104 goes way, way beyond that so that every fee, every adjustment to a tax break would require a supermajority requirement.
This next question goes to our opponents. Some suggest that supermajority requirements like Measure 104 help improve the legislative process because they demand more compromise. The same point has been made about the filibuster in the United States Senate and how removing it for judicial nominations has resulted in even more partisan Supreme Court nominations. In a time of hyperpartisanship, isn't it better to have rules in place that require broad support, and doesn't Measure 104 accomplish that?
Do you want me to take that? I don't think it will usher in more bipartisanship at all. If you want things to be more bipartisan, then you have to have more members of the other party elected, because that will force us to compromise or work with the other team more because they have more say in what happens and they have more votes in the legislative process. Here's an example of what I think it actually leads to. I think it leads to what I refer to as hostage taking, not bipartisan compromise. House Bill 2391. This was the bill that set up the funding for our state's Medicaid program. It ultimately led to ballot measure 101. The Republicans initially refused to vote for it, and it required a 3/5 vote. Somehow, they got Sal Esquivel, a representative from the Medford area, to offer up his vote, and in exchange for that, us Democrats needed to vote for a bunch of things for Medford and his district that many of us didn't support, but we knew funding the Oregon Health Plan was more important.
I think if you take a look at your voter's pamphlet, which was just mailed out this week, I think, to most everybody, you'll see within one of the arguments in favor of this measure, a measure signed by 6 current and former legislators. And I think they make a compelling argument. 3 of them are Democrats, 3 of them are Republicans, some from the House, some from the Senate. They together have years and years of legislative experience. They make a compelling argument how they believe this measure, in fact, will just do the opposite, and increase cooperation. The best policies Oregon has always adopted have always been adopted through consensus and bipartisanship. We do best when we talk together. We do worst when we have people using whatever leverages they have to jam something through on a bare majority. Most bills in Oregon pass with great majorities. This will encourage more of them and more of that discussion. Thank you.
This next question starts with our proponents. Why are supermajority requirements necessary at all? If Oregon's legislators increase taxes or fees in ways that voters disapprove, then we can just vote them out in the next election. and hold them accountable through the referral process?
Of course, that's the ultimate way to change the legislative process. But once the legislative process or the election process is completed, what we need to find is more ways to have people work together on the common good rather than in a partisan manner. And that's the whole emphasis, I think, behind Measure 104, and as I just mentioned, the view that those 6 legislators share in terms of supporting Measure 104. Yes, elections are important. Yes, elections have consequences, but that still doesn't mean that when everybody gets in that building down in Salem, they don't have to find ways to work together to make Oregon better. And that's what we think Measure 104 will help to do. It will restore the accountability in the process, the accountability that Oregon voters chose in 1996, the accountability that lots of other states have chosen for the same reason. And we think it's therefore going to improve government and improve conversations and improve the ultimate product for the Oregon people.
There are 2 ways that you can accomplish a policy goal that costs money. You can either spend directly on it, or you can give somebody a tax break to do it. Like housing. You could spend directly for affordable housing, build new units, or you can give a developer a tax break to develop affordable housing. What Measure 104 does is it puts those 2 things on a completely different level, so that if you want to cut spending for affordable housing, it's only 50%. If you want to cut a tax break for affordable housing, it would be a supermajority. Now, either way, that sounds nice, but then consider who is really getting tax breaks versus direct spending. Direct spending is often for senior services, education, firefighters, whereas tax breaks are often for corporate special interests like ORS 317374, the tax break to promote mining for metal.
So my question was about sort of the wisdom overall of supermajority requirements. And I want to allow you to sort of circle back to that. Are you suggesting, or is your side suggesting, that supermajority requirements are not necessary for any purpose, or for the very specific purpose of Measure 104, with the notion that if voters are unhappy with their legislators, they have an opportunity to hold them accountable at the ballot box?
Well, while AARP agrees with that premise that we should have simple majorities for everything, because that's the democratic process. That said, what Measure 104 does is create brand new inequities in how we treat tax breaks versus direct spending.
I'll allow our proponents to respond.
Well, just in one example, I'm glad the housing example was just brought up, because this brings to the forefront one of the major reasons why we're here today. Housing is a critical problem in Oregon. It's every survey you've ever taken or given or read about talks about that. One of the major concerns a lot of us have in the next legislative session is there's a concerted effort to take away the middle class's major benefit in terms of housing, and that is the mortgage interest deduction or real estate taxes deduction. It was very controversial when the feds did it, and they did it in this last December tax reform. We want to make sure that doesn't happen in Oregon, and without Measure 104, it can be done on a simple majority. That's a huge change with a simple majority.
I'm going to move on to their next question, which I believe starts with our opponents. Is that right? Am I keeping track there? The No on Measure 104 campaign says the measure will make, quote, bureaucracy harder to cut and cause, quote, waste to grow. Please help us understand, how does making it more difficult to increase revenue by requiring larger majorities to increase revenue grow the size of government? On the face of it, that seems backwards.
How does it grow the size? I'm not sure how it grows the size of government. Tax expenditures in state government parlance are the same thing as spending money for a purpose, okay? And just like we examine programs that we fund directly for their effectiveness, we should do the same with tax expenditures and tax breaks. To the point of the proponents of this measure, we absolutely have a housing crisis in this state. We're not spending enough money at the state level to address it. The mortgage interest deduction is a perfect example of a deduction that is in need of some reform, because it's not an equitable deduction any longer. 61% of the mortgage interest deduction benefits flow to the top 20% of income earners. If we could scale that back a little bit, that would free up money that we could spend on housing for people that are struggling to afford it.
So the question again is that proponents say that the measure will cause waste to grow and a bureaucracy to increase. Do you agree or disagree with that position by the proponents? By the opponents?
Thank you. As Paul already stated, for our side, the same argument was used in 1996 by the same groups who opposed Measure 104, that gridlock would materialize and that nothing would move forward in Salem, and those concerns actually did not materialize. What this is about accountability, and especially when it comes to raising taxes. Taxes and fees right now currently do not automatically sunset. In 2009, the legislature opted to sunset or to eliminate on a 6-year basis and to re-examine tax expenditures. So there is extra accountability built into those tax expenditures that were already brought forward. Taxes and fees don't have that same accountability. And so our proposal is that we don't think that this brings gridlock, this brings more accountability and a better conversation around how we are increasing taxes and fees in Oregon.
For years, state leaders, editorial pages, and budget analysts have been warning about rising PERS costs. Both candidates for governor are calling for increased education spending. And the state has long-term infrastructure needs that will demand significant new spending. Given these challenges ahead, do you think that Oregon has a long-term budget problem? And if so, what effect will Measure 104 have on that problem? For the proponents first.
I think no one in Oregon who reads a newspaper or sees TV can disagree that we have a long-term budget problem. And it's a long-term budget problem not because revenue doesn't continue to increase. Our revenue increases except during depressions, and we do have those, and we need to be prepared for those. But our revenue increases faster than most other states. It's just that our expenditures increase even faster. So if you think about it as the water balloon, if you push on one part, it expands somewhere else. Right now, because of the inability to have major interests within the legislature come to agreement about how to control some of the structural spending problems we have in this state, which are impinging on schools and every other public service, the only remaining place to go is new revenue. Having some additional accountability on revenue will help balance that discussion, and we'll have a combined revenue and expenditures discussion to meet the budget problem, not just a revenue issue.
I think any legislator that's looking at our state budget and our expenditures would agree that we have a spending problem and we're going to have to try to figure out how to rein in some of our costs. But I think my side of the aisle, we also think that we have an investment problem, and that, sure, we've got to do something to rein in some of the costs that we have, but we have underfunded schools, a healthcare system that we haven't figured out how to fully pay for, and even if Measure 104 fails, which I hope it does, if we have to have new revenue, if we are able to marshal the forces of the legislature to find new taxes, either on ourselves or on business or on corporations, that is still going to require a 3/5 majority to be able to do it. New money, new taxes will still have to be approved in the same way.
So the yard signs right now that I see out and about say that Measure 104 is anti-democratic. But supermajorities are common in our democracy. At the national level, there are supermajority requirements to impeach federal officers and to ratify treaties. And in my research, I've identified at least 16 states that have some sort of supermajority requirement for tax increases, including a 3/5 majority in one state. Isn't what Measure 104 proposes a rather ordinary example of the democratic process?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, candidly, if you're how you structure government and the Constitution and the process really matters. If you don't think you can get the outcome by electing people to the legislature, having your side and your values be the predominant party or the predominant will, then you change the process because you're unable to get what you want through the political process. And I personally, I mean, this is probably no shock to any of the listeners here if they've looked at my record, would like to raise more taxes for schools and healthcare and underfunded services in this state. And so people put these 3/5 requirements in because they want to make it harder to do something they don't want. And yeah, it should be harder to amend the Constitution. It should be harder to impeach somebody because sometimes politicians make unpopular decisions, and they shouldn't be thrown out of office just for making an unpopular decision, and that's why that threshold is higher.
So thanks. I represent a lot of individuals, a lot of small businesses that feel like they don't have a voice in the political process. And these folks may reside in rural areas of the state. They may not have the ability to purchase or to contract with somebody who can speak for them at the Capitol. And these are the very folks that are asking for more of a voice, that are asking for a real conversation to be had about some of those loopholes that are actually impacting their businesses. That's the small businesses with less than 10 employees that saw a bill in 2017 that would increase their tax rates. That's homeowners, that's farmers, that's family farmers who saw an attempt in 2017 to raise taxes by $500 million in their sector. And so these individuals see this as an opportunity to participate in the democratic process.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, Vice President and Political Director for DHM Research and moderator for today's debate on Measure 104, a statewide ballot measure to amend the definition of revenue in the Oregon State Constitution. Joining us are Paul Cosgrove, an attorney with Lindsay Hart, Jenny Dressler, the Director of Grassroots at the Public Affairs Council, John Bartholomew, Government Relations Director at AARP Oregon, and Rob Nose, State Representative for Oregon House District 42. This next question starts with our proponents. Opponents of Measure 104 say that it will create a situation where a simple majority of the legislature could pass a tax break or some narrow tax loophole, but it would take a supermajority to close the same tax loophole. First, do you agree with this? And second, what is the rationale for what some see as an unbalanced approach to tax policy?
Thank you for the question. The voters have already decided, and we've been living for 22 years with a process which gives a little bit more of a strength to the argument of don't tax first. In other words, we passed Measure 25 in 1996. That established the supermajority requirement. I'd like to point out that the kinds of things that opponents of this measure often talk about are tax credits, which are given for very special purposes, sometimes very narrow purposes. And in Oregon, all those tax credits all expire automatically in 6 years. So it's not a difficult thing to get rid of those kinds of tax credits. They will go away. And in fact, it will take another vote of the legislature to extend them for another period of time. So I think that the argument that's been made there is just missing the point. The people have already spoken. The Constitution already requires 3/5. All we're talking about is, should it be all taxes and all raising revenue, or just a very few things? And that's what Measure 104 is about, is redefining and controlling the loopholes that the legislature has created over the last 22 years.
So let me give one example of how this would change things. Oregon still has a program called the Senior Medical Deduction, where certain individuals over a certain age can deduct, now it's subtract, from their taxes the cost of medical expenses. The program used to be really, really poorly written, and of course it was created by a simple majority originally. It was so poorly written that billionaires could have their granddaughters getting medical procedures and be able to deduct those from their taxes. Most of the benefit was going to people who were still making over $80,000 a year. The legislature decided they needed to change that, and they reined it in so that most of the benefit now goes to people who really, really need it, and in the process freed up some funds for great programs like Oregon Project Independence and a tax break for small businesses. That would now, just changing it, require a 3/5 majority, which does not seem like what is good policy.
I'm going to allow our proponents to make a counter, and then I'll allow you to respond as well.
It's a great example. That was a bipartisan effort to reform a tax measure that needed reformation. One of the primary proponents was the vice chair of the House Revenue Committee, a Republican. It was a bipartisan effort. A problem was identified, a problem was solved. That's the kind of thing we should be asking our legislature to do, not to have bare majority fights on important issues like raising $500 million out of the pockets of the smallest of Oregon businesses and trying to do that on a bare majority. That's what we need.
But the problem with that was that, well, that was one example of people working together. What Measure 104 would do is now create an opportunity for every one of thousands of fees in Oregon, every tax break that's in this tax expenditure report, which, there's over 360 tax expenditures in this that would then create leverage. It would then create leverage for a superminority to be able to say, oh, I want my special perk, I want my pork project, or I want to kill that bill. Now you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of opportunities to do that.
I believe this next question first goes to our opponents. The No on Measure 104 campaign says that adding the supermajority requirements to fees and repealing tax credits would make it more difficult to respond to emergencies, including wildfires and earthquakes. How exactly? Can you please describe what fees or existing tax deductions would be affected by Measure 104 that would be placed at greater risk if it would take a 3/5 supermajority to change? And if there were a genuine crisis, isn't it reasonable to expect that there would be broad bipartisan response?
I think if there was a genuine crisis, yes, we'd be called into special session, and I suspect, hopefully, everybody would rise to the occasion and the fee would be approved. Here's an example of one that I think might not be, I think is a genuine crisis. Others might disagree, and it would allow for the kind of game playing that I'm worried about. I think it's no shock that many groups in this state, in light of the shootings at Parkland High School in Florida, are very intent on bringing forward sensible gun reform legislation of all different kinds, okay? A legislator or a group of legislators opposed to these bills could threaten to withhold a vote or tie up a vote on a critical fee or tax that's needed to fund a budget, and subsequently take those things off the table. And that's the kind of thing that I am worried about.
So, those are not partisan issues. In my experience, and I work with a lot of natural resources agencies, we recognize that, and you'll see through the history that fees almost always get way over a supermajority as a vote from the legislature. You have to go back to the 2013 session to find an actual fee vote that was somewhat partisan in how it passed. In the agricultural sector, we have a nursery licensing fee that helps us market our products. That's a bipartisan effort where legislators from both sides, the industry, and agencies come together and work to find a solution to protect their products and help market those. We've seen a lot of positive fee increases where everybody has come together in a bipartisan way, and I just don't. I don't see how those emergencies are the partisan issue that.
I'm going to allow our opponents to respond. The campaign website does specifically call out wildfires and earthquakes.
Okay, sure. I mean, those kinds of things are going to be bipartisan, all right? But if that's the case, then why sweep every single fee into the bill? The thing that the proponents of this measure are hunting is that they don't want us to reduce the mortgage interest tax deduction. And they are nervous that Democrats, who might still hold majorities in the legislature in 2019, will be able to look at that and examine it and tinker it, okay? And so you have put something on the ballot because you don't think you can get it through the legislative process, but you can preclude us from doing it through the initiative process. And good for you. That's your right to try to do that. But I think it's bad public policy.
Proponents can respond.
There are two things that was stated. One is fees, and so let's talk about this. If we were still talking about fees as being fees for a service, a driver's license fee, that kind of a thing, we would not have included, and I was one of the drafters of Measure 104. We did not, in our initial draft, include fees. But then the legislature found another way to have a loophole, a $1.4 billion loophole to fund a brand new program with $1.4 billion of revenue and call it a fee and get around this requirement. So that's the reason fees are included. But as Jenny has pointed out, most fee increases pass with more than a supermajority. They pass almost unanimously because they've been worked out together in advance.
Let me read to you the fiscal impact statement from Measure 104, which was approved by the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, Head of Department of Revenue, and others. It reads, "The fiscal impact to state revenue and expenditures is indeterminate. From where you sit, what should Oregon voters know about the probable impact if the state were to pass Measure 104? And I believe we start with the opponents. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not surprised it's indeterminate. I mean, we don't know who the governor's going to be yet. We don't know how many Democrats or Republicans are going to be in the legislature. And so, yeah, of course it's indeterminate. You can't predict how the political process is going to play out until you arrive to it and show. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised that it's indeterminate. What's not indeterminate to me is that I do think it will empower a superminority, once they figure this out, how it could work to hold up things that they don't want. Here's another example. Somebody figured out that we have to read every bill on the floor of the House in its entirety because our Constitution calls for it, unless you get a 3/4 vote to suspend the rule or a 2/3 vote to suspend the rule to do that. Well, we have routinely been provided that because guess what? In the year 2016 and 17, we have photocopiers. We don't have to read the bill aloud. But if you want to hold up something, you can demand that the bill be read aloud so you can delay a vote or make something not happen. And now we all understand that tactic and might use it.
I think the reason that the people who were listed by John determined that the fiscal impact is indeterminate is in fact that those folks, and the elected ones are all Democrats, representatives of no party, realized that this was in effect what we have had since 1996 with one change with respect to fees, and it has not had a significant impact in the state's opportunity to find revenue when it needed revenue, to raise fees when it needed to raise fees, and to balance its budget. And that's why it's indeterminate, because in fact it doesn't have a direct impact on any of those issues. We're getting a lot of discussion about gridlock and sky is falling. Earthquake and firefighting, those are red herrings. What's really at issue here is, do we have accountability in the process where if the legislature is going to raise revenue, regardless of how they label it and regardless of how they do it, do they need to reach a bipartisan consensus?
I'm going to move on to the next question. I believe we start with the proponents here. What people or groups may be at increased risk of harm if Measure 104 passes?
If Measure 104 passes?
If Measure 104 passes.
I can't think of anybody who's at harm if Measure 104 passes. I can think of a number of people. We've had several of the groups or interest groups mentioned who would be at harm if it doesn't pass. Homeowners will be at harm if it doesn't pass, because it's very clear, Representative Knowles pointed it out, and they're members of his caucus who are already drafting bills to change, to eliminate, reduce, restrict. We don't know quite what the parameters will be, the home mortgage deduction. That's the greatest middle-class way we have increased home ownership in the history of this country. There are lots of small businesses who were greatly harmed by a bill that passed in 2018 by less than a supermajority in both houses that took away $244 million worth of tax cuts that small businesses had been granted through a federal act that was automatically implemented in Oregon. There were people in the House who wanted to take a $500 million tax increase on small businesses in 2017. Luckily, the Senate killed it. So there are lots of people on the other side. I can't think of anybody who would be harmed if Measure 104 passes.
For opponents, what people or groups may be
Well,
at
shocking, I disagree with that. So first of all, the Trump tax cut was a federal tax cut. And because Oregon has consistently connected its state income tax with the national income tax, any cut that rolls through, in theory, is supposed to roll through to here. But we do it out of convenience and practicality, not because it's a matter of good public policy. Nobody who was supposed to get a tax cut on their federal taxes didn't get one because the state legislature decided that we didn't want to pass that on to state and blow a $200 million hole in our budget and have teachers be laid off, or have even a shorter school year than we experience, or have people kicked off the Oregon Health Plan because we didn't have the money to do it. Everybody that was going to get a federal tax cut got it. We just didn't want to extend a state one as well for a lot of reasons.
We're going to move on to audience questions in a moment, but in the sort of spirit of civic and civil dialogue, I'm going to give you both a chance at this question. Are there any arguments from, we start with the opponents this time. So are there any arguments from the proponents that while you ultimately may disagree with, you believe that they are reasonable and do merit consideration?
That's a terrible trick question.
I believe that we should always be visiting, when you have, tax increases of large amounts or fee increases of large amounts, that we should take a look at them seriously and determine, is this good public policy? But the opposite is true as well, that we should look at existing public policy and say, is this good public policy? And if it requires changing a tax break to make it more efficient, make it better use of our government resources, then it should be on an equal par with spending for education and spending for healthcare and spending for senior services.
So for the proponents, are there any arguments from the opponents that while you may ultimately disagree with, you believe that they are reasonable and do merit consideration?
Yeah, I think that we do talk about adding fees to this mix, and what does that mean? What could it mean? And I think that does deserve a closer consideration. In my mind, most of the fees, at least the ones that I have worked on, have passed on a bipartisan vote. They've passed with well above a supermajority. The reason that the fee discussion is included is because, again, of that attempt to raise $1.4 million in new revenue and to call it a fee increase. And that's a question for the voters is, does that warrant more than a simple majority to raise $1.4 billion? And so that's where I would answer that.
For our radio audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm John Horbeck, Vice President and Political Director for DHM Research and moderator for today's debate on Measure 104, a statewide ballot measure to amend the definition of revenue in the Oregon State Constitution. Joining us today are Paul Cosgrove, an attorney with Lindsay Hart, Jenny Dressler, the Director of Grassroots at the Public Affairs Council, John Bartholomew, Government Relations Director at AARP Oregon, and Rob Noss, State Representative for Oregon House District 42. Now let us go, now we'll go to our closing statements from we start with the opponents this time, right? Is that right?
Okay. Sorry, the cord got a little stuck there. So in closing, first of all, thank you for having us here at City Club. Really appreciate this conversation, and it's great to be with the folks who are on the stage. I would say Measure 104 would amend the Constitution in such a way that minor adjustments to fees and efforts to reduce waste in government would become bargaining chips for horse trading in the state legislature. Measure 104 would amend the Constitution to put tax breaks for mining, oil and gas, and other industries on a completely different level than funding for schools, foster children, senior and disability services, and firefighters. Measure 104 would amend the Constitution to make it more difficult for the state to protect consumers from unscrupulous and abusive business practices. Take a quick look at who is for and who is against constitutional amendment, Measure 104, and you will see that this measure is designed to protect corporate special interests at the expense of most vulnerable Oregonians. Measure 104 is unnecessary, will lead to politicizing even the smallest fee increases and will allow a superminority to dictate policy in Oregon. Please vote no on Constitutional Amendment Measure 104.
And thank you for having us here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to hear both sides of the debate. Measure 104 merely clarifies what Oregonians intended when Measure 25 passed in 1996, and what was universally accepted for 15 years thereafter. This is about making sure that politicians are held accountable when they raise revenue. Measure 104 cracks down on political runarounds and protects homeowners, taxpayers, farmers, loggers, a lot of Oregonians, by closing this unfair loophole. It encourages bipartisanship and consensus building, which Oregon is already well known for. Also, the Constitution, voters are the body to vote on constitutional changes, so we are happy to have this opportunity to make the pitch to them. So we would encourage your support of Measure 104. Thank you.
Now we're going to go to audience questions. For everyone watching, listening today, is welcome to ask a question. We'll not be taking questions from the microphone. Instead, if you've written a question on an index card, hold it high so City Club staff can collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. Debaters, each side has 45 seconds to answer each question. Who are your top 3 financial donors? What does it say about your coalition? We'll start with the proponents.
The proponents' campaign is supported by about 45 business associations, and beyond that, individual companies and individuals who have brought this measure for you, paid for the signatures to be gathered, the over 188,000 signatures of Oregonians to put this measure on the ballot and to start running the campaign. A great number of those dollars did come from one source, the Oregon Association of Realtors, and you've heard a lot about home mortgage deduction. Realtors have a special interest in that because they are representing homeowners and home buyers, and they know how important that is in order to get people to achieve the American dream of buying a home is the deductibility of mortgage interest and property taxes.
The question was top 3. Do you know who the second and third largest supporters are, donors are?
The Oregon Association of Auto Dealers and the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association and the Oregon General Contractors, commercial contractors are within the next couple. I'm not sure which would be the next 2.
For our opponents, who are the top 3 financial donors and what does it say about your coalition?
This is embarrassing. I'm not exactly sure who our top 3 donors are. I can make the proponents know. I can make a guess that it's going to be the labor movement in this state that's opposed to it. It's they are often on the watch out for protections that are good for consumers and voters, and looking out for how are we going to pay for the services and the programs that we rely upon from state and local government. So my guess is that's probably where money for our opposition to this is coming from.
And you're right. It's the 3 big government employee unions that are the sole support of the campaign at this point, with almost no exceptions.
Wasn't the question mostly about what our coalition is all
So the
about?
second part of the question was, what does it say about your coalition? So if you want to answer that question, we'll turn back to the proponents as well.
Well, so the No on 104 coalition is a very, very broad coalition from everyone from American Heart Association, Common Cause, League of Women Voters, Oregon PTA, nurses, firefighters, and Portland City Club. Businesses around the state, small businesses from Columbia River Coffee Roasters in Astoria, Mahonia Farms and Sisters, Siskiyou Alpaca in Cave Junction, to Nike as well. And so it's a very, very broad coalition of hundreds of organizations all across the state.
For a point of clarity, City Club of Portland has not taken a position on Measure 104. I will allow our proponents to add any additional comments about what your funders say about your coalition.
As I mentioned, it's a broad group of businesses and individuals, but in some of them are very small. The Clackamas County Bank has two branches in Sandy and Welch's, if I recall correctly. they're a supporter, a recent supporter. Compare that to Nike. That points out big businesses know how to get the tax breaks they want to know, that they need or want. Small businesses have trouble doing it. Our loggers, our truckers, our auto dealers, those farmers are among the small businesses who are supporting Measure 104.
Here's another question from our audience. Taxes and fees are fundamentally different things. Fees are paid for a service. Why should fees specifically require a supermajority, especially when the budget must be balanced? That is the question verbatim.
For who?
Sounds like a question for you guys.
For proponents? Go
Well,
ahead.
we'll start with, yeah.
Sorry.
So the question was, why should
Taxes and fees are fundamentally different things. Fees are paid for a service. Why should a fee specifically require a supermajority, especially when the budget must be balanced?
So we've given the example of the Clean Energy Jobs Bill that would have raised $1.4 billion in fees for a broad suite of potential services and benefits provided to a broad suite of groups. I work a lot within the natural resources sector, as I already said, and what we have seen in the past is that when the legislature gets strapped, as they did during the recession in 2009, they look to those fee dollars and those funds and sweep and or shift those funds and move them into the general fund when they're looking for extra money. So we've seen that. We typically, a lot of those programs, because they provide both a public health benefit and a benefit to the farmer or to the rancher, you see a 50-50 split for that dual benefit. But as we move away from that, we need some more accountability and scrutiny on those fee dollars.
Any comments from opponents?
You know, we've heard a lot about this $1.4 billion fee that the legislature is going to assess. And first of all, I want to challenge that number because the longer we hang out trying to figure out how we're going to do something about carbon pollution, the cost of that program and the fee that's going to be assessed to do it gets less and less and less, and the impact of that gets less and less and less. As the process plays out, as advocates come before us and make their case about what needs to be done or shouldn't be done. And so I would argue that, you know, we've been trying to pass something in that sector, and the advocates who have concerns do their job. We haven't been able to pass a bill around carbon because the advocates are doing their job, revealing the complications and things they disagree with and making their case. They don't need a 3/5 majority to stop it.
Another audience question. This one is for the proponents. If your intent was to protect the mortgage interest deduction, why did you write such a broad measure that includes 2,400 and more fees?
The loopholes that we're trying to close are at the moment directed specifically, amongst other issues, but most publicly against mortgage interest deduction. But the kind of things that happened in 2017 and 2018 were directed at other people. The small business tax cut, part of the grand bargain a number of years ago, was under attack in the House, passed by a bare majority, a cutback so that the smallest of Oregon businesses would not be eligible for that lower tax rate. And that's the kind of thing that we want to make sure that in the Constitution we state a general rule. If it's raising revenue, regardless of how you label it, it ought to have a 3/5 majority. We didn't make it subject specific. We made it a process question.
So here's what I would like your listeners to understand is that tax votes are very controversial. They're hard to pass, even with a simple majority often, let alone a 3/5 requirement that is needed to pass any tax in the legislature, which is not going to change as a result of Measure 104. We will still have that threshold, all right? They are often the votes that are used by the other team against Democrats to tell voters, no, don't vote for these people, don't put them back in office. This is what they're doing. And that is what campaigns are about, and that's what the process is about. And if we take votes that campaigns reveal that are bad or you all don't like, then you should vote us out of office. That's the process that we should be using.
Another question from the audience. Is this measure a valiant effort to starve Oregon government of revenue by making it more difficult to generate income?
I'd be glad to answer it. If you've been watching where the state budget has been going over the last decade, since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, our budget has gone up double digits every biennium in terms of revenue from existing sources of revenue. Our budget is not starved, and it shouldn't be starved. We have needs that need to be funded. The question is, are we going to be able to control the expenditure side so that we can live within that increasing revenue, or are we always going to seek out new revenue and never deal with the expenditure side? I think Representative Noce would agree that the expenditure side controls, the big picture expenditure side controls, we've not been able to tackle yet. That's where the gridlock is.
I don't think this is so much about starving government as much as I think it's creating an inequity of prioritization. What this does, it makes it much more difficult to change or repeal a corporate tax break. Whereas everything else that we spend money on, whether it's education, healthcare, senior services, requires, it could be cut by a simple majority. We're now talking about corporate tax breaks needing a supermajority to be even altered. I think that's what this measure is really about.
I'm going to do my best to read this one. For proponents, why should a supermajority be required to disconnect from a congressional tax cut, reducing Oregon's revenue that was never debated by the Oregon legislature?
The answer is, until the 2015 Seattle City Light case, undoubtedly it would have required a supermajority and always did require a supermajority. It's only in recent years that the legislature's attorneys have considered what the court decision meant and construed very broadly the ability of the legislature to do those kinds of things. We operated for years in that mechanism where those exact kinds of changes would have required a supermajority, and we did it successfully.
I mean, that was a federal tax cut. Oregon, yeah, we had a very robust debate about whether or not we should stay connected to the federal tax cut and pass it along, or we shouldn't. And us legislators did not want to blow a hole in the school budget. We did not want to cut funding for the Oregon Health Plan. We did not want to cut back on other services. And so no, we didn't enact a state tax cut on top of a federal tax cut that was already coming. Unlike the federal government, we have to live within our means. We don't have the ability to borrow and extend a tax cut to voters and at the same time maintain the service level by borrowing money to be able to do it.
Thank you very much, everybody. Our time is up, and we need to pause the discussion for now. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next week. We are adjourned.